Mr. Sunil Bedimadou, Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, Mrs. Anissa Mangu, Partner at KPMG and Lead Consultant on the 2022 Scorecard Assessment Report, Directors of the National Committee on Corporate Governance, heads and officials representing both public and private sectors, members of the press, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. In our midst today, we are very fortunate to have several eminent speakers: the Honourable Minister of Financial Services and Good Governance, the Chair of the National Committee on Corporate Governance, the Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, as well as the KPMG lead consultant behind the second edition of the Scorecard Assessment Report 2022. All of whom have kindly agreed to share their insightful observations, as well as their vision, not only on the corporate governance journey achieved so far by corporate Mauritius, but equally, if not more importantly, on the various corporate governance aspects that still require some improvement, as well as the key projects that are in the pipeline that will positively and significantly impact the corporate governance landscape of this country. I am therefore extremely pleased to welcome you to this awareness session that will highlight essentially the key findings of the 2022 edition of the Scorecard Assessment exercise, the report for which was launched in October 2023. The 2022 report, as you know, is based on 66 key performance indicators of the Corporate Governance Scorecard for Mauritius, which was launched back in October 2021. These KPIs cut across three corporate governance dimensions. Number one, board effectiveness, which is measured by 27 key performance indicators. Number two, audit oversight and effectiveness, which is measured by 19 key performance indicators. And the third dimension, the third corporate governance dimension, relations with shareholders, stakeholders, sustainability and inclusiveness, which dimension is measured by 20 key performance indicators. As chair of the technical subcommittee of the National Committee on Corporate Governance, allow me to kickstart this awareness session, two generic observations of mine on the 2022 Scorecard Assessment Report. Firstly, the second edition of the Scorecard Assessment exercise has witnessed the voluntary participation of 27 entities, including, of course, public interest entities, but notably also including several state-owned enterprises. This in itself underscores the increasing importance which corporate Mauritius attributes to corporate governance practices and corporate governance reporting in the country. My second observation, notwithstanding the different array of profiles of some of this year's participating entities, participating in the 2022 scorecard exercise, the overall weighted average corporate governance score has risen from 54% in 2021 to 67.5% in 2022, which demonstrates, I think, a significant leap, demonstrating the business community's confidence in the corporate governance journey. These results seem to indicate that with adequate support, organizations willingly embrace the supreme goal of enhancing the quality and level of corporate governance disclosures, substantiated by evidence-driven explanations. We must not forget that our code is driven by the apply and explain principle, even though, of course, there are still areas where improvement in the quality of disclosures is required. It goes without saying that for the 2023 Scorecard Assessment exercise, and of course, ensuing editions after, the National Committee on Corporate Governance relies on the continued and regular participation of public interest entities. PIEs, as we call them, fulfill a strategic and public role in providing an array of essential goods and services: banking, finance, insurance, transport, water, electricity, to name but a few. And all this fosters not only a culture of robust corporate governance practices in Mauritius, but equally importantly in positioning Mauritius as a reputable and resilient international financial centre. So with these few introductory remarks, I now have the pleasure to invite our first eminent speaker, the chair of the National Committee on Corporate Governance and also my boss, Mrs. Aruna Rakitun, for her address.
Who is the director of the NCCG and also the chair of the technical committee of the National Committee on Corporate Governance. The Minister for Financial Services and Good Governance, Honourable Sunil Dutt Bola, the second Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, Mrs. Sadhna Siraj Gopal, Mr. Sunil Benimadu, Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange, Mrs. Prabha Chinia, the Registrar of Companies, Mr. Siu Sankar, Director of the Financial Services Commission, Ms. Lakshmi Apadu, Acting Chief Executive of the Financial Services Institute, Mrs. Anissa Mangro, Partner of the KPMG, Board Members of the NCCG, Members of the press, distinguished guests, all protocol observed, good afternoon. We are gathered here to take stock of the findings of the Scorecard Assessment Exercise 2022. Anissa Mangro will be later sharing with you the detailed findings of that exercise. The Corporate Governance Scorecard 2021, as well as the two successive assessment exercises we have carried out in 2001 and 2022, have been overall well received by the business community. In 2021, we saw the participation of 21 listed companies, and there were therein several large corporates and 2 parastatal entities. The year after, the exercise was open to public interest entities, and we saw the participation of 27 organizations, of which 8 were parastatal bodies, and there were a number of repeaters from 2021 as well. For the 2023 assessment exercise, which we are currently doing, 24 entities have registered their participation. From these exercises, it's interesting to see what is shaping up. Firstly, there is an increasing number of parastatal entities volunteering to have their governance framework assessed. Secondly, there are several repeaters year in, year out. Thirdly, once the assessment reports are out, there are several participant companies reaching out to the technical committee of the NCCG for active discussions on their performance. Fourthly, several financial services regulators have had their governance framework assessed through the same exercise. Fifth, the level of participation in these exercises year in, year out is good, which shows that organizations in Mauritius are using the scorecard to improve their governance practices as well as their disclosures. More importantly, from these 2 exercises already carried out, we have now meaningful empirical data to show that governance practices and disclosures by organizations in Mauritius are improving. This can only be beneficial for our IFC. All these insights augur well for our jurisdiction. The NCCG is thus achieving the objectives it had set when it first developed the Corporate Governance Scorecard for Mauritius. But we would not have achieved this without your collaboration, ladies and gentlemen. Corporate Mauritius has collaborated fully by actively participating in the assessment exercises year in, year out. Thank you, and please carry on to do so. What we are not seeing, however, is research work and papers from academia world on the findings of these assessment exercises. These research work and papers have their place in the corporate governance ecosystem, and I am hopeful that it will be remedied over the next years. I will seize this opportunity to thank Mrs. Anissa Mangrou and the KPMG team for the fantastic work they did for the 2022 assessment exercise. I would also like to acknowledge the strong collaboration of the NCCG with the University of Mauritius back in 2021 when we elaborated during COVID time the Corporate Governance Scorecard and its user guide. Looking ahead, there are a number of important developments happening in the corporate governance landscape in Mauritius. Firstly, we have the review of the 2016 Corporate Governance Code for Mauritius. Following a tender exercise, PricewaterhouseCoopers has been selected as the local consultant which will assist the NCCG in reviewing the 2016 code. Work has already started. Your comments, feedback on what has worked and what is not working, these comments matter to us. We will be carrying out a survey as well as holding focus group discussions to gather your comments. This will happen during two stages. Firstly, prior to elaborating the first draft of the new code, and secondly, once we have the draft, which will be circulated, then we will seek your comments on same. Following the signature of the OECD Country Partnership Programme, OECD will be an active stakeholder in the review of the 2016 code, as they will seek to align the new code with their recently revised G20 OECD Principles of Good Governance. Here I'd like to say, this new code will be your code. It will be only meaningful if you, public, private sector enterprises, take an active role in interacting with the NCCG during those advocacy sessions. We invite you to actively collaborate with us during those working sessions, and it is only through a collaborative approach that we will shape the code and the governance practices which we want. A tentative target date for the launch of the new code will be October of next year. Second important development, the Finance Miscellaneous Provision Act 2024 has amended the Financial Reporting Act, inserting a new section, Section 69A, which requires all public interest entities to register with the NCCG. And this as from the 1st of January of next year. And in so doing, to pay a fee prescribed by the NCCG. This marks an important evolution for the NCCG after many years of lobbying in its quest to become autonomous and independent as the national body coordinating corporate governance matters in the jurisdiction. The NCCG at the moment is busy on an e-registration process for public interest entities through its website. We are contemplating charging public interest entities a nominal amount per year as prescribed fee. We will communicate further on this matter in the press. This self-financing will enable the NCCG to structure itself and to man itself properly so as to be able to carry out its projects. I would like to, at this stage, warmly thank Minister Golin for his open door policy and collaborative approach in supporting the initiatives of the NCCG. On an ending note, as we co-create the governance compliance ecosystem of Mauritius, let us be mindful to refrain from indulging in prescriptive, box-ticking process, but rather adopt a meaningful, agile governance compliance process which will enhance the attractiveness of our IFC. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. I shall now invite our next speaker, Mr. Sunil Belinbaldu, Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange, to address you. Thank you.
So, Honorable Sunil Bola, Minister of Financial Services and Good Governance, Mrs. Sadhna Gopal, Second Deputy Governor, Bank of Mauritius, Mrs. Aruna Arakisun, Chairperson of the National Committee on Corporate Governance, Mr. Prakash Sivsankar, Director, Chief Operating Officer, if I'm right, of the Financial Services Commission, Mrs. Prabha Chinian, Registrar of Companies, Mr. Mathieu Lamport, Chair of Technical Committee of the NCCG, Ms. Lakshmi Apadu, Acting CEO of FSI, Directors of the NCCG, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It gives me immense pleasure to be amongst you, and I would like to thank Mathieu and Aruna for inviting me to say a few words on this occasion. And I think Mathieu and Aruna have said quite a lot on the progress that have been achieved over the last 2 years, and which I think underscores the importance that our PIEs, listed companies, but also unlisted PIEs, are attaching to corporate governance. So in my short intervention, I felt that I would take a slightly different angle and thought that it would be useful for me to share with you some time series findings on the importance of corporate governance. And these findings, as I share them with you, will demonstrate very clearly that corporate governance is not only something nice to have or to practice, but that it really adds value to different stakeholders, but essentially to shareholders, and that it helps to reduce the cost of capital for companies that practice good governance, and that investors, by and large, especially in today's world, are looking not only for companies that do very well from a financial standpoint, but companies that adhere to strong and good corporate governance, because you will see many of those investors clearly say that they would divest from companies that are not doing well, not adhering to good corporate governance, even if their financial performances are very good. So, how do I move this?
I think it's this one. I think it's the other one right there.
Yeah.
This one. Ah.
Okay. Good. So, first we'll. Sorry to keep you. Well, we'll see at what investors generally consider to be the 4 key pillars of good corporate governance. And then I will share some data and statistics to show to you how some time series analysis clearly underscore the kind of value creation that good corporate governance can bring to companies. We will see also why investors are willing to pay a premium for well-governed companies and what is the value or the extent of that premium. And then I talked about how good corporate governance, there is a correlation between good corporate governance and reduction in the cost of capital, so we will see what happens. And then we will also, in the end, focus on how bad governance destroys value. And we look at some very famous cases where leading companies in their industries for a long period of time destroyed all value in a very short period of time because they were, badly governed. And we'll see how destructive this can be. So, there was a survey done by Morgan Stanley on what global investors consider to be the 4 key pillars of good corporate governance, and based on the responses of these investors, this is what they came up with. First of all, accountability of board is fundamental. Board should be accountable for a company's actions and decisions. Transparency in revealing data and financial statements, but also non-financial statements are very important. Accurate, timely is critical. Responsibility, of course, ensuring that companies are complying with all the laws and regulations within the space in which they evolve. But last but not least, fairness in the treatment of stakeholders, especially minority shareholders, is critical if you want to create value. This brings me to, there are tens of studies that have been done. I've narrowed it down to these 3 studies. For example, the first one focuses on 24 governance factors of 1,500 large US firms, and they've come up with the conclusion that strong governance companies outperform poorly governed companies by 8.5% in terms of their share price on an annual basis. Another one by Bedchuck still came up with the same kind of conclusion, that well-governed companies tend to outperform poorly governed companies, and based on this study, they talk about 7.4%. And CFA Institute in 2015 published a very important report which clearly mentions that 64% of institutional investors considered corporate governance crucial in their investment decision, which means that if they have doubts about a company's compliance, they would certainly not look at these companies. This very interesting study by a guy called Muzaffar Khan, relying on companies within the MSCI index, has looked at more than, I think, 6,500 companies and looked at those that would qualify within the top quartile and those that would be in the low quartile, and see how their, the value of investments in these companies would evolve between 2009 and 2017, which is almost a 10-year period. And it's very clear that there is a correlation. I won't talk about, for those who do statistics, I won't talk about causality, because there may be other factors that, other than corporate governance, that have helped these well-performing companies in the top quartile to outperform. But the fact remains that many of these studies show a strong positive correlation between those that adopt high governance against those that don't follow good governance in spite of their good performances. Premium. I mentioned about good governance, but what brings these companies to outperform others? It's because investors sometimes are willing to pay more for companies that are practicing good governance. everything being equal elsewhere. So if we take two companies, just for argument's sake, both of them have been growing at 30%, but there is a perception that company A is practicing better governance than company B. Well, investors over a period of time would be willing to pay a premium. And according to McKinsey in 2002, investors in general are willing to pay a premium of 12 to 14% for companies with strong governance practices in North America and Western Europe. And in emerging markets, this premium is even higher, 30% more for companies that are practicing good governance. And then look at this question: are investors willing to pay more for a company with good governance? According to McKinsey in Latin America, when they did that study, 83% said yes, 81% in Europe, and 89% in Asia. So it's very clear that the practice of good corporate governance would help companies to create value, get premiums, and eventually reduce the cost of capital. I'm not going to go through all these studies. I just mentioned them for your information. But look at the graph here, which I think is quite revealing. So first, you have the developed world. So you have the world cost of capital. So they're combining cost of equity and cost of debt together. So the cost of capital, you can see for companies that have low ESG, okay, is higher than those that have high ESG, okay? So if you look at just the cost of equity, it's very clear that high ESG reduces your cost and your cost of debt too. And for emerging markets on the second row, it's the same pattern that we see. So it's very clear and it's understandable because let's say companies like Moody's or Standard & Poor's are evaluating the risk of default of a company that has issued debt. I'm sure that they would put a premium and reduce the cost of borrowing or the grading that they give to a company that ticks all the boxes in terms of good corporate governance, whereas somebody that may be doing well, but that has issued a bond of 10 years, but practicing bad corporate governance can go into default, as we will see when we look at some cases of bad corporate governance. And this one, I'll end up, so it's comparing, MSCI, normal companies, the world index in blue, which comprises all companies, and then the yellow one looks at ESG leaders, and the light blue one looks at social responsibility companies, which also practicing ESG, but have added a dimension of social responsibility. And you can see over a period of time that the price to book value is better for those that are, so correlation same, and the return on equity is also better. So very clearly, these studies, I think, comes and tells us a very strong message, which is, good corporate governance creates value. Creates value. I would even go to the point of saying that there might be some causality, direct causality. And PwC's investor survey mentioned that 79% global investors, so they're talking to institutional investors globally, consider ESG factors as critical in their decision making. 2021, nearly half, 49% of institutional investors said they would sell their holdings if companies fail to address key ESG issues, irrespective of whether their financial performance are very good. So I think this is critical. And this Russell Reynolds survey in 2000, evaluating corporate governance, has poor governance cause you to reduce or divest? Continental Europe 53%, even 20 years ago said yes, UK 48%, and US 61%. So I'm pretty sure that this has increased today. That's why you see the PwC talking about 79%. So all this is very coherent. So just to end my presentation, because we talk about corporate governance creating value, but bad corporate governance destroying value for leaders in their respective fields. Everybody knows about Enron, which was a leading energy company for I don't know how many decades, but then they just, you know, went into bad practices. They were clearly doing the wrong things, and they destroyed 74 billion, more than 20 years ago, of value. WorldCom, 100 billion of destruction in shareholders' value because of poor corporate governance. We know Lehman Brothers because we all are very tuned up to we almost paid the price of people like Lehman Brothers in 2008, doing the wrong things, trying to increase, you know, profits, but taking huge risks. You know what happened to Lehman Brothers? They were exposed to those, what do we call, collateralized debt obligations that were very poor in ranking, but they had AAA ratings, and they invested massively in those. And they were leveraged 34 times their reserves and capital to invest in high risk. 34 times. So this also, what happened to Lehman Brothers also clearly underscored a failure of regulatory oversight. In a country like the US, it's amazing. I mean, the country which brags that, you know, it is one of the leading financial centers in the world, it has had the biggest failures. Enron, WorldCom, Lehman Brothers, which almost brought the whole world to its knees. And very close to us there in 2017, there was Steinhoff, a major German company, but dual listed on the JSE, one of the leading companies. Even at some point in time, we were having discussions with them, and they did manipulation of their accounting, and 90% of their share value dropped within a few days, and then you know why occurred. So, just to end, I think direct correlation, premium valuation, lower cost of capital, reduced risk, enhanced performance, protection against corporate failure, investor preference, long-term growth. So there's nothing more to that. Thank you for pushing our companies. And I think it would be interesting, maybe when we have some history 5 years down the road, to see how our well-governed companies are doing in terms of all those metrics. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sunil, for this very insightful presentation on the correlation between good corporate governance and value adds for companies. And now I would like to invite our keynote speaker, the Honorable Sunil Bula, Minister of Financial Services and Good Governance, to make his keynote address. Thank you.
Mrs. Sadna Kuba, Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius. Mrs. Aruna Radhakishan, Chairperson of the NCCG and Board of Directors of the NCCG. Mr. Prakash Sankar, CEO of the Financial Services Commission. Mr. Sunil Yenmadu, CEO of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. Mrs. Chinian, Director of the Registrar Company, Mrs. Anissa Mamou, Partner KPMG, Mr. Machilanko, captains of the industry, members of the press, good afternoon. Needless for me to say how I am pleased to be among you today on the occasion of an awareness session on the findings of the Scorecard Assessment Report 2022. And thank you, Mr. Belmadu. In fact, it is a very insightful and very informative presentation, very well worked as well, very structured one as well, with all the research, findings that we have from across. In fact, this event organized by the National Committee on Corporate Governance in collaboration with the Stock Exchange of Mauritius Limited and the Financial Services Institute By the way, I have also to salute Mrs. Papadou from the FSI, marks an important step in our ongoing journey toward excellence in corporate governance. Every one of us here has gone through assessments since young, be it in the form of exams in school or performance appraisals at work. Ultimately, such assessments seek to achieve two main purposes. First, to inform us of how we are doing, and second, to point us to areas where we can improve. In the same vein, the scorecard and the assessment report highlight areas where the quality of disclosures can be improved, can be enhanced. This underscores the need for continuous vigilance, training, and efforts to refine our corporate governance practices. The vision of my ministry is to position Mauritius as a jurisdiction that is transparent and that operates at a very high standard. This vision is at the core of our commitment to fostering a robust international financial center. My ministry is actively engaged in promoting and enforcing good governance practices to safeguard national values and eradicate fraud, corruption, malpractices, and irregularities in all aspects of public life. We have seen good governance brings transparency. Transparency brings trust. Trust brings investments, and investments generate growth and economic development. The governance aspect is implemented through two main bodies under the purview of my ministry, namely the Office of Public Sector Governance and the National Committee on Corporate Governance. The OPSG is tasked with implementing good governance standards within the public sector, while the National Committee on Corporate Governance issues standards for corporate governance in the private sector. These bodies ensure that governance principles are embedded both in the public and private sectors, fostering a cohesive and integrated strategy that resonates across the entire economic landscape. While there are several noteworthy milestones, there are two particular accomplishments that resonate as a testament to our collective dedication. The successful exit from the Financial Action Task Force, FATF Grade East, and the subsequent recognition as one of the top-tier jurisdictions compliant with all the 40 FATF recommendations are landmark accomplishments. Despite being delisted from the FATF Grade East, Mauritius has continued to maintain its momentum in the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. We have continued to carry out several strategic initiatives, such as conducting a risk assessment and enacting and amending several legislations. This has reinforced our position as a jurisdiction of substance anchored on a robust anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism and proliferation framework. These achievements are a collective success involving collaboration with relevant stakeholders, international organizations, and the private sector. Launched in October 2021, the Corporate Governance Scorecard is a tool that has been developed using global principles and internationally recognized good practices, such as the OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. Mauritius is among the very few countries in the world which measures progress in corporate governance practices in a structured, objective, and quantifiable manner. The first assessment report was released in 2021 and was open to organizations listed on the main market and the DM listings of Stock Exchange of Mauritius. The second scorecard assessment in October 2023 was open to public interest entities as defined in the first schedule of the Financial Reporting Act 2004. 27 organizations voluntarily took part in the scorecard exercise. And individual and title results and findings have been, as was the case last year, anonymized to preserve confidentiality. The report strengthens the business community's confidence in its corporate governance journey. Progress is evident with an average CG-weighted score of 67.5% compared to 54% in 2021. We need to peel deeper beyond the scores to look at what they are telling us, including any underlying trends. Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation of annual scorecard reports should therefore not only look good as end-of-year events, but go a long way in embedding good behaviors in everything we do. There is so much that has been done, so much still being done, and so much to do. By working together, government and the private sector can pursue their coordinated efforts, consolidate our reputation as an international financial center of excellence, and enhance the resilience and sustainability of our economy. At this juncture, let me extend my appreciation to the NCCG for its dedication and expertise in advancing corporate governance in Mauritius. Allow me to commend the Technical Committee for its meticulous work in developing, refining, and implementing the scorecard. I also appreciate the fact that key stakeholders, such as the Financial Services Institute and the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, have set out together on this issue. This committed ecosystem of partners, all running around the cause of good governance, is the backbone of our progress. Mauritius will continue to play an important role in shaping the future and economic prosperity of Africa. We are leading by example, and we have become an inspiration for our peers in the region. We have before us unique opportunities for our leaders to build institutions that will serve our country and our region well. A positive corporate culture can look different from company to company, but I believe there are some common elements. The first is a culture that values feedback. Second is a culture that embraces diversity. Third is a culture that seeks improvement, not just at the board or organizational level, but at the level of the individual as well. Finally, boards must also set the tone for the appropriate level of transparency and disclosure. I therefore urge boards and directors to think about how you can set the right tone from the top, inculcate the right values, and cultivate the right culture within the organizations. I leave you with a quote from Rohini Nilekani, an Indian writer and author, and I quote, "We cannot be mere consumers of good governance. We must be participants. We must be co-creators," end of quote. So let's all engage as co-creators of good governance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Bola, for your keynote address. We now come to the crux of today's event. I will invite Anissa Mambu to share with you the findings of the assessment report 2015.
Honorable Sumaudu Dwala, Minister of Financial Services and Good Governance, Mrs. Amagopal, the Second Deputy Governor of the Bank of Mauritius, Mrs. Aruna Radhakrishnan, Chairperson of the NCCG, Mr. Sunil Venimandu, Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, Mrs. Prabhachinyan, Registrar of Companies, Mrs. Lakshmi Apadu, Acting CEO of the FSI, Mr. Matthew Longpole, Chairperson of the Technical Subcommittee of the NCCG, board members of the NCCG, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, good afternoon. It has been a privilege for KPMG to accompany the NCCG for this second exercise of the scorecard. I will start by setting the scene on the methodology. Let me just check. This one. Yes. So I'll start by setting the scene. Mathieu did touch on the approach, but I think it's important as well to understand the approach that was adopted, to also understand and interpret the results. So as Matthew explained, the scorecard has three main dimensions: board effectiveness, audit oversight and effectiveness, and relation with the shareholders, stakeholders, sustainability and inclusiveness. Each one of them has a number of indicators, which are 66 in total. The NCCG has released in 2021 what is called the Corporate Governance Scorecard for Mauritius User Guide, and this is available on the website. This will give you all the criteria for each of those indicators. For each criteria, you would get the set of rules, which will tell you how do you meet adequately, this is the term, partly or inadequately satisfy those criteria. And this is what we actually use as the base to do this assessment. Second, I think, important item is in terms of how these three dimensions relate to each other. Board effectiveness would represent 40%, audit oversight and effectiveness 30%, and 30% for relations with shareholders, stakeholders, sustainability and inclusiveness. 27 companies did participate to that exercise of the 2022 scorecard exercise. The information that was used by the KPMG team, and that's also an important factor, is the publicly available information. We had to apply a cutoff date, so that was April 2023, and we used for that exercise the latest published annual report that was available on your website, any sustainability report or equivalent that was there, and any ad hoc information that was on the website. For that exercise, I think learning from experience as well, NCCG added one additional step for last year, and I understand from Matthew that this will be further enhanced for the new exercise. So that step, we had individual draft reports that were shared with the different organizations that participated for comments. I'll just put a disclaimer on this one. We are assessing against publicly available information. Sometimes we've seen in that journey that the comments were very valid comments, and of course we could adhere with that, but we still need to go back to that publicly available information, because the way we are interpreting that and the way that an investor or a shareholder or a stakeholder is interpreting that should be the same. So for those who've embraced this journey, I would really encourage you to continue and disclose that information in your new publications that you're having. Now to get into the details of those, maybe just on the process. Once we've completed that step, we had another step, which was the jury panel, where the NCCG had set up an independent jury panel to look at those results, challenge as well the results, so that we have, I would say, an independent pair of eyes looking at those results as well, prior to finalizing the scorecards. The technical subcommittee has been instrumental as well in that last milestone for their support, so thank you for your support on that. Looking at the different dimensions, I will start directly with board effectiveness. So this one has in itself 3 sub-dimensions. I will take a bit of time to go through each of those sub-dimensions, because as we have previously mentioned, there has been good progress between the 2021 and 2022, and where we want to get better is to go into those small details, which would help increase the score as well for this coming exercise. So board effectiveness, 3 sub-dimensions: corporate structure, 16 indicators, governance, 8 indicators, and remuneration, 3 indicators. When you look at the score, average score was 70% across the 27 organizations, with scores ranging from 29% to 85%. What is quite interesting is that out of the 2022 batch, 16 of those organizations were above average, while if I compare to 2021, only 2 were at that average level. So there has been, even if I would say my population was not same for the 2, but there has been progress on that. If I look at corporate structure, the slide is quite dense, and I suppose we can share that with them later. But I want to take a step back and just talk about what is in corporate structure. First, composition of the board. There has been a lot of discussion around composition of the board, proportion of executive, non-executive directors, how that is respected at all levels, proportion in subcommittees. This is one of the requirements. Second would be the size of the board. And when we say size, it's not just the number of people, it's also how it commensurates with the nature and scale of the activities. Third, having an independent non-executive director as chairperson of the board. And if that isn't the case, what are the safeguards in place to make sure that there is no groupthink at the board level? Having the appropriate balance of diversity, skills, experience, knowledge at the board and subcommittees level. These would be, I would say, those areas that are expected. And when I take a look at the results as well, those are some of those areas that require a bit more disclosure. Composition of the board, there is progress. We are progressing as a country, but still some of those organizations still need to continue that journey. The explain part on how do we encourage independence and not go towards groupthink. And this is one of the examples that we've seen in the responses from organizations where we can understand from what we are reading that this is not something which is publicly disclosed. So these are the things that we see are things that can easily progress the scores. Then we have those areas where I would say these are information that are already available but not disclosed as they should be. These would be, for example, directors to provide details of directorship. Overboarding policy of a company. Overboarding policy is quite important because we want to explain to the readers how do directors dedicate sufficient time to deliver their duties. So it is important to explain what is the policy of the company and to disclose the details of directorship. Same induction and orientation program for directors. Readers want to know how directors themselves are onboarded and know about the companies. Training and development of directors. A lot of focus is put on people, and I'll talk about that in the third dimension, but more towards employees. This one is about how about the directors? How are they trained? What is the development program? And then the process for nomination and appointment. Some more, I would say, key senior positions as well. A lot of annual reports talk about CEOs, obviously. CFOs, some do. And then, for example, the company secretary, it is a requirement as well, but this one is not necessarily disclosed. Succession planning for the board, senior executive managers. Sometimes we have a note on succession planning, sometimes not up to the level of senior executives. And then the usual ones that we've seen in most of the annual reports we've looked at, organization chart, statement of accountabilities and job descriptions. Sometimes not to the level that is required. So I would say on this one, even if it is a strong sub-dimension, we are talking about 73% in terms of average score. These are easy fixes on those which require more disclosures. The second part would be around governance. So governance, this one, we are talking about the board charter, the code of ethics. So yes, in most cases we've seen there is a board charter. We've had access in some of those cases to the board charter. there is mention of a code of ethics, then the third expectation would be, how does the organization report on the effective implementation of the code of ethics? This is where it gets a bit more tricky, because the company or the organization needs to have a process in place to measure the implementation of the code of ethics. So this would be an area where we've seen a requirement to progress. This subdimension also has requirements on quite a few policies. I'm talking about conflict of interest, related party transactions, your data privacy policy, for example. All of this would fall into this category. So we've seen quite a few documentation around this, but I would say not in a consistent manner, which brings a bit the scores down. Then there is an area under this governance subdimension, which is more of a descriptive in nature. This is what, when we discuss, and you would see in the report, these are what we mention as being quick hits. These would be, and this is really, when I had the discussion with some of you, quite common sense, but it is there. For example, directors receiving the board packs and board papers in advance. It is not explicitly mentioned. If it's not mentioned, I cannot, I would say, guess that it is there. Second would be directors having access to senior management and external consultation to clarify board matters. This seems also quite logical, but it needs to be explicitly mentioned. Independent directors having the opportunity to meet and consult with each other prior to board meetings. So these would be the areas where disclosure is key, and we've seen a lot of organizations not scoring on those because these elements were not disclosed. And then I would say that the last one would be on the key matters that are discussed at board level and subcommittee level. On this one, I think if we look at the general trend in terms of reporting over the last 2-3 years, there has been very good progress. A lot of organizations are disclosing matters like IT, security, CSR matters. It is starting to be more the norm, but still we have seen quite a few organizations which are not yet on disclosing the key matters that are disclosed, that are discussed, sorry. So on this dimension, the score has progressed from 50% to 64%, but still quite a few, I would say, quick wins there that can be materialized in the disclosures. Third one, remuneration. This one has, I would say, despite us saying that we are in a culture where we don't want to be disclosing remuneration, it is quite a good score, 84%. So when I look at the requirement, it's the remuneration philosophy of directors, senior managers, how much are being paid to the different directors, how also organizations are ensuring that the compensation packages align with their remuneration policy. Do they have a corporate governance committee? Do they have a remuneration committee? Or is it prescribed by a specific requirement or law? So for these ones, I would say to go to the next step would be more details. More details on breakdown in terms of basic benefit, bonuses, fixed, variable, and how is remuneration directly linked to performance of the organization. So these would be the next steps for remuneration. So the next dimension is audit oversight and effectiveness. This one, same, we have 3 sub-dimensions: risk and internal control, audit, and external accountability. When you look at the scores, the average is 68% for 2022, with same score ranging between 34 and 94%. The average score is quite higher, significantly higher as compared to 2021. We are talking about 33% higher, which is quite a big leap. And we also see here that 15 out of 27 are above average, bringing I would say, the whole group up as well. In terms of the requirements around this, first would be the risk management framework of an organization. What is expected here is for organization to tell what I would say their risk management story, starting by what are the risks that are material to me, my inherent risk, which are important to my organization, my context, to the era in which we are living, to the new emerging trends on the market, the global trend. We spoke about sustainability, about ESG, about cyber. What is material and important to me? That's my first step. Second step to continue that journey would be, what do I do as an organization to mitigate those risks? And what is my residual risk? This graph comes from the report, the 2022 report. If you look at the green part, you would see that a lot of organizations disclose what they call significant risk, so that would be my inherent risk to my business. This one, most of them are quite comfortable to report that. Then the risk mitigation strategies, a bit less comfortable. This is not a one-to-one. You would see some would disclose in a bulk what they do as risk mitigation strategies. Others would be very diligent, going from a risk appetite statement to my different inherent risk to my risk mitigation strategies. Then, where there is a lot of room for improvement is, once I have, say, my statement, my inherent risk, how I would do to mitigate them, a lot of them stop their journey at that point. They don't go that step beyond to disclose their residual risk, which would give finally the reader insights on finally what is material, what is left to be managed by the company. So this is where I think the most, if we want to be moving from the existing score to a higher score, would be where most of the work will have to be done. And maybe one comment as well, we've seen a lot of disclosures done in a generic manner on the risk side. So on this one, I would really encourage companies to do this exercise, and that would tie back to the next one, which is audit, where we've seen some progress to be made on the audit committee role and responsibilities. Because the expectation on that one would be, first, the audit committee, the composition itself, the role of the audit committee, and then that role goes beyond just the financial statement. So this is, I would say, for my part, if I take a step back, I read both together. If we have a strong risk management properly disclosed, that ties back as well to the role of the audit committee, which is also to have oversight on the risk of the companies. Under this sub-dimension, which has a good average, we're talking about 72%, we have audit committee composition, role, how do they discharge their oversight, its role of oversight. And then second one would be internal audit. Internal audit, and we've seen in the organizations, we have all type of functions. You have an in-house function, you have an outsourced function, you have a function that is not led by that company which submitted the report, but by a group entity, for example. In those scenarios, independently of where the function sits, the expectation is to give the reader comfort that the company has an internal audit function which is independent and which is covering the main risk of that company. So we are expecting to be seeing there the description of that function, how the findings being raised are being addressed, how it actually adds value in terms of the work that is being done. Does that internal audit function have sufficient resources, qualifications, skills to address those risks? And we have seen, based on the different, I would say, organizations and structure, that sometimes the information is very limited on internal audit. Third one, I would say more traditional external audit. On that one would be at least to explain to the reader how findings from external audit are addressed, and if there is any rotation, how is that being captured? And also if any non-audit services are being delivered. This one was fine, no major things on external audit, more on the role of the audit committee to go beyond, and on the internal audit role as well. The third sub-dimension under this dimension is external accountability. This one, we have the more traditional disclosure about the director's statement to the effect that financial statement give a true and fair value and fair view This one, I think most of the participants scored strongly on it. Then we have quite a few information on compliance to the code, but over and above that, it's all the information which would give to an external reader the organization's internal and external environment and how it links to that internal and external environment. And this is where I think we haven't seen this. What we're expecting to see is a description of the business model. How does it transform the inputs, the outputs? How does that link with the strategy of the company? How does that link to the KPIs as well? And what are my internal considerations and my external considerations? When we look at this, and I think on this one, the score has been quite different based on the company. We have some who have scored very strongly, but others who've stayed on the more traditional disclosures related to compliance. So this one, quite a lot of room for progress on this sub-dimension. One comment on this chart, which comes also from the report, you would see that in terms of, let's say, full disclosure, out of the 27, I have 29%, which is there on full disclosure. And on no disclosure, which is more those who have not scored, 50%. So on this one, quite a lot of room for improvement. On the third dimension, same, we have 3 sub-dimensions: conduct of shareholders meetings, 7 indicators, relation with stakeholders, 5 indicators, and sustainability and inclusiveness, 8 indicators. On this one, this is the one dimension overall which has shown the most progress. Audit showed good progress. This one is most progress. When I compare to last year, well, not last year, 2021, the score was 49% average score. And 2022, we are talking about 63%. And this one is the only dimension where we have a company scoring 100%. And that company, I will illustrate a few, but they have met all the requirements of the scorecard. So this is the only one. Out of the 27, 14 organizations have scored above the average as well. So when we look at the journey 2021, 2022, we do see quite an important increase in this specific scores. And with sustainability and ESG coming down the line, at least I have a personal expectations. I will read the report of the 2024 report. There is an expectation that this continues to grow and increase. First sub-dimension, this one is quite a straightforward one. This one is really about the conduct of the shareholders meeting. Each resolution should have 1 item, sufficient details in the notice, disclosure of the profile of directors seeking reappointment, agenda item to be explicit, shareholders question time to be planned on the agenda, which is quite logical, but still we are expecting this to be explicit, and providing alternative ways to be voting, and we've seen that change with COVID, and publishing the votes on the website. On this one, we've seen that we had a score of 67% in average, and this could easily be almost 100%. There's no reason, but it's just making sure that this information is disclosed. Second one, which is the relation with stakeholders. So we've seen that there has been disclosure of major shareholders. This is there. But going from the shareholders to the wider stakeholders, there is still a bit of room for progression. So that's one of the first area. Second, we've also seen that training and development of employees, people at the heart of organizations, is greatly valued, but still going to the next step. Sometimes we have some generic sentences saying that training is being provided, but going to that next step to see what type of training, what population, is it the whole of management, or maybe health and safety is more relevant to one, anti-money laundering is more relevant to another population. So going to that next step. Third area would be on inclusive employment policy. So in that one, some have started disclosing their own policy. What do they mean by inclusive employment? Some are not yet there. Some have also set their own targets in terms of diversity covering age, gender, other type of diversity as well. Some are not yet embracing the journey. And then disclosing information about employees, gender, age profile, length of service. So all of these are what are expected under this subdimension. Third subdimension, sustainability and inclusiveness. This one had a score of 64%, but can still be pushed beyond that one. Expectation on this one is, does the company use any established framework like the UN SDGs or any other example of framework for them to manage their priorities and manage their sustainability commitments? Second would be, does the company have a proper governance structure around sustainability? Do they have a sustainability committee at the level of the board? Do they have a dedicated team on sustainability? So these would be the governance structure around sustainability. Second would be, how does the company engage and support local communities? This one, with CSR being, I would say, quite present over a few years, we've seen a lot of companies scoring on this one. But just a reminder, sustainability is beyond that area of CSR. On this one as well, what is expected would be, how do the organization engage in their wider stakeholders with dialogue as well? What is being done? How are they as well looking at the adverse effect of their operations on the community and on the external stakeholders? On these ones, as and when we also progress on our sustainability and ESG journey, this should become, I would say, more and more embedded in the disclosures. So we've seen some companies, some organization able to articulate this in their disclosure, but still some room for improvement. And then the third item would be about how the company prevents or repairs any of the damages it's doing to the environment, and how does it offset its carbon footprint. These conversations would be more and more on the table, so we are expecting to see more and more of those in the disclosures. And last indicator is, how is the board assessing and acting on climate change risk? So quite a long list of areas of improvement. I've tried to prioritize, but in the end I said I'll just keep it so that we have the full list. And on this one, even if it has progressed since 2021, we are expecting that this is an area which will continue to progress. So on the overall scores, if we look at the scores, and we've talked about the progress from 54% to 67.5%, you can see that all the dimensions have progressed very well. The exercise of 2021, if I remember correctly, it was 21 companies, 21 organizations. 2022, 27 organizations, not the same population. So as and when NCCG will continue to gather data, this will give you a more refined way of looking at things. But it would be good to encourage the organizations to participate year on year so that you get a good base to see the trends as well, and maybe in 5 years' time get the return on investment assessment as well. So on this note, I would like to thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I think that's a very insightful overview and of all the dimensions and the sub-dimensions within corporate governance. So I think we have a 10-minute or so question and answer session. So I would like to invite any one of you who would have an observation or a question that you would like to direct to any one of us, to the KPMG team. So the floor is now yours.
Some ground rules. We keep it to the topic, nothing outside. Okay, your gentleman, okay, professional, right? Please state your name before you put your question through, and if you want your question to go to a specific person, then please say so. Thank you. Sunil.
Yeah, just an observation, and when I was, first of all, thank you for this very comprehensive presentation of the findings, and main point for me is there's been progress, and quite substantial progress along many of those criteria, so it's very encouraging. Just one observation where I want to query, because I don't know which criterion it was on. You mentioned that this year there's been 16 out of 27 that have scored at least above the average. But last year, where there was 21, you mentioned that there was only 2 that scored above average. But statistically, is that possible? Unless you have very huge, everybody got 10 and there were 2 that got 80 or 90. Then you would end up in a situation where only 2 have scored above the average. So this is what, struck my attention listening to you. So was that right, or was that an oversight when you were comparing? Because it's very rare that the average out of a population of 21, just statistically, you have only 2 that goes above the average. You understand my point? It just struck my attention being, in figures and statistics. So I said I would ask you this question.
If you look at the progression, the average progressed as well. So that would explain. So in that scenario, and Ben is there, he's done all the calculation in our team as well. In that case, the average was very low.
So the variance was huge.
The variance was huge. Yes. On some of those, there has been a huge gap on the reporting under audit.
So then
this is where the variance.
Tremendous progress.
Yes. Yes. And the other point, the baseline is not the same, which is a bit difficult for this exercise.
And it was the first time that the scorecard was implemented, also in 2021.
Yes.
So people didn't, I think, institutions and entities didn't realise maybe how to apply the scorecard, the 66 indicators, some of which have more important indicators than others. So that could explain why for that specific sphere, the companies didn't score very well. Yeah.
Perhaps what we are anticipating is in the 2023 report, there will be also significant improvement, because by then companies would have digested the 2 assessment reports that come out, the quick wins which Anissa talked about, and that will show. So we need to wait a couple of more years to see what we have. Yeah. Any other questions?
Aruna, I have a question for you as the chairperson of the National Committee on Corporate Governance. Your committee, ma'am, has recommended...
Okay, can I have your name, please?
Chapir from GFA Insurance.
Okay.
Your committee has recommended many disclosures for an annual report by corporate. I have in mind here the remuneration of directors. I have read in some annual report that the remuneration of directors are not disclosed individually. What they have done is only to lap the remuneration of directors and use as premise that the information is sensitive in order not to disclose. So my question is, when will your committee recommend that this disclosure be made mandatory?
Do you want to answer as chair of the technical committee? Because these questions come to the technical committee or not.
So,
I think that's a very fair question. So let's perhaps situate the context a little bit here. The participation is voluntary. That's the first thing. We have established a scorecard to facilitate, to aid, to assist entities wishing to take part in the scorecard assessment exercise. so that they know what type of information to disclose. They know what type of information to disclose. That doesn't mean that they're forced to disclose it. If they don't, hopefully, if our markets are information efficient, as Sunil was mentioning earlier about research between corporate governance and performance, then the reluctance in providing that information should somehow be reflected in the market, taking these companies to task. So I don't think it is a task for, as we're going to do a correction, Aruna, for us to impose mandatory legislative rules and regulations. That is not the purpose of the code, and it's certainly not the purpose of the scorecard. You'd like to add it?
Just to add on to what Matthew has said, moving away from the scorecard and putting things back into context, the NCCG is not a regulator. It is a policy making body which is there, which advises, which recommends. If you look at all the projects the NCCG has come up with, for example, the DEI charter, diversity, inclusion, and so on, we can only prompt organization to voluntarily adhere to. So we cannot impose anything. It then becomes the province of the statutes, of the legislation, to impose, like the FRI says, public interest entities have got to adhere to the code and so on. That's a separate matter. And then there is also an important organization within the ecosystem in Mauritius, which is the Financial Reporting Council.
Yeah, so I think first we have to, well, I don't have all the details of the code of governance in my head. We have to figure out whether it is a requirement of the code of governance to disclose individually the remuneration packages of executive directors.
It's in the guidance notes.
In the guidance, but is it a requirement in the code?
Not
so it means that companies that are lumping are still complying with the code. The reason why I asked this question is because otherwise the Financial Reporting Council clearly mentions that a public interest entity, which is a listed company and other companies, have to abide by the code. Otherwise, the auditor would not sign the account. So, if we want to tackle this issue, we would need to amend the code in the next version and then say that as a public interest entity, a company needs to disclose individually the remuneration packages of its directors.
And I know that the Financial Reporting Council, when they send out the letters to companies, they do take such matters up. But it is not the province of the NCCG.
So they are complying, but if we want to take a step further, we need to change that.
Sunil sits on the board of the FRC as well. Nafi, very happy to see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think the companies have helped us to some extent. The recent amendment to the law there requires us to disclose individuals.
I was going to. There must be some.
It's coming.
Sorry, yeah. Well, I think maybe there's there's a lack of knowledge on this. We did amend the Companies Act some time ago to require companies, and here I'm talking about public companies. I'm not talking about PIEs. I'm talking about public and big private companies to disclose individually directors' remuneration. I fail to understand why the gentleman mentioned about not disclosing.
I think he was referring to the code, but it is mandatory
in the law.
Under the Companies Act.
It's already mandatory in the law. Yes, they are doing it, and this is what I said. I fail to understand why there is mention about not disclosing this. So we went well beyond the code, and this is now the law, and it's the law. Yeah, that's the law. And if you're filing an XBRL, which all companies have to do now, they have to disclose. Otherwise, it's rejected.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Personne? Généralement, on a beaucoup de questions technical. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So first of all, I would, on an ending note, I'm going to try and sort of like summarise everything in about 5, 6, 7 points that I've noted down whilst the eminent speakers were addressing the audience. Point number 1, I will start with the wise words of the Minister, talking about the necessity, the importance of building feedback into the corporate governance system to build trust. Now, in this regard, and I think Anissa had alluded to something that the National Committee on Corporate Governance introduced in the 2022 Scorecard assessment exercise and further refined in the 2023 Scorecard assessment exercise. And in the 2022 Scorecard assessment exercise, we opened up a window whereby the initial scorecard assessment reports would be shared with participating entities, and there would be a window of about 15 days within which participating entities would have the possibility to provide comments and maybe counter some of the scores and the rationale for scores given by the assessor. Of course, everything is dependable on publicly disclosed information. So we introduced this novelty in the 2022 scorecard assessment exercise. And in 2023, what the National Committee on Corporate Governance has decided is that we will close the feedback loop by better engaging with our participating entities. So once the participating entities have that window of 15 days to provide feedback on the initial scores that they receive, there will be a brief report that the consultant, the assessor for the third scorecard assessment exercise will provide to the participating entities, so that participating entities can then realise that they would have some feedback on the comments that they make. That's point number 1. Point number 2, I think, thank you, Sunil, for showing us an array of research that shows that good corporate governance is good for the country, is good for the company. And perhaps allow me to establish some sort of relationship, even though it's only a correlation, it's not necessarily causal. So good corporate governance, yes, it reduces risk, because if the risk management processes are well governed, that should reduce risk. And if it reduces risk, then obviously when the entities tap financial markets, the cost of finance should go down. And if the cost of finance should go down, this, I don't know whether you all remember your 101 finance. So if the cost of capital goes down, right, the value of the firm should go up. My third observation is, I think, something regarding monitoring effectiveness. So I think this is probably where the host of improvements can be done. How do we monitor effectiveness? So we need to probably explain better. For instance, you were mentioning, Anissa, in terms of board effectiveness. How was the board composed? How did they reach that size? And the composition, number of independent directors, non-independent directors, executive directors, to ensure that there is no groupthink, to ensure that there is what we call open debate. The literature calls this cognitive conflict. So there is open debate, there is constructive debate. No stone is left unturned. So yes, this is something that needs to be better explained. Similarly, you also mentioned, I think rightly so, that we disclose a lot on certain aspects of risk management, but to monitor the effectiveness of risk management boils down to the disclosure of residual risks and whether the residual risks are within or outside the board-approved risk tolerance level. I think also there's probably, I think a key point is
entities taking part in this scorecard assessment exercise should indulge in their own self-evaluation using the 66 indicators. And I think if that exercise is done, I know that when we were mounting the scorecard framework, we had done that very same exercise at the working committee, whereby 5 or 6 of us were using the 66 indicators, evaluating these indicators, applying them to a particular company, that's what we call a dry run, to see whether the indicators were well understood, well harmonized across everyone's understanding. So I think entities taking part in the scorecard assessment exercise should obviously indulge in that self-evaluation. Remember that the scorecard framework is there to help companies improve their corporate governance journey. The other point that I would like to highlight is, we did mention adequate disclosure. Although there are 66 indicators, these indicators have what we call an importance level, ranging from 1 to 5, where 4 and 5 are very, very important, and 1 and 2 are not so important. So I think if we want to improve our reporting of good corporate governance practices, then we should focus on those areas, those indicators where, relatively speaking, the indicators are relatively more important than other indicators, and ensure that for these important indicators there is adequate disclosure. Now, of course, the scorecard exercise would not exist without the voluntary participation of entities, private sector, public sector, state-owned enterprises, public interest entities. Like I said, they fulfill an immense function. And my wish, personally, is to see to it that public interest entities take the commitment to participate voluntarily, not this year and not the other year, but every year, so that then we build a real database of information that would be good for researchers, that would be good for analysts, that would be good for institutional investors, and I think that would do the country wonders. So I think this summarizes, the gist of the discussion that took place today. I would like to thank all the eminent speakers, Honourable Buna, Aruna, yourself, Sunil, and of course Anita. And I would like to thank, of course, all the participants for the observations and questions that they have asked. Thank you to Lakshmi and her team for having organised this together with the FSC. Thank you, Mr. Prakash, for hosting us and for making this event a reality.